When I covered Creep back in December, I briefly mentioned that I would possibly explore writer-director Christopher Smith's further filmography. I think he's a modest yet relatively unique filmmaker. He hasn't made anything I'd consider truly masterful, but his small selection of films certainly provide a few creatively subtle subversions to the horror genre. However, probably his most recognised film to achieve cult status was 2009's Triangle, a psychological thriller that, above the surface, is your typical slasher flick, but deep below, in the depths of its philosophical abyss, is a heart-wrenching Greek tragedy that puts the concept of the hero-villain dynamic on trial. Triangle tells the story of Jess, a quiet yet clearly troubled 30-something-year-old who is invited on a sailing trip by her friend before a storm leads to a shipwreck, causing them to seek refuge on a mysteriously empty ocean liner occupied by a vicious masked killer. To say anything more is an utter spoiler, so if you haven't seen it and want to be completely surprised, I literally cannot say anything else. But for the rest of you, if you're looking for another YouTube explain video, you're better going elsewhere because, as always, I'm only going to explore it in an emotional context. As a broad overview, Triangle sets itself up to be like any other rough-around-the-edges slasher flick with a sprinkle of Kubrick's The Shining in between. A bunch of people get stalked by a killer, each of them die one by one, and our emotionally tormented final girl saves the day and escapes. Job done, now let's get smashed. Or, well, that's what it sets out to make you believe. The thing is, Triangle was marketed with a considerable disadvantage. In order to hide its massive mid-story plot twist, the film essentially had to shoot itself in the foot and rely on generic contextless footage that undersold the innovative aspects of its story. I'm not saying that knowing the twist would have helped. In fact, I actually think it would have alienated certain audiences or caused an influx of plot hole know-it-alls who likely wouldn't have given the film a chance, but a bit of narrative mistake or teasing something shocking and unexpected would have gone a long way to generate some intrigue, especially considering that's exactly what Cabin in the Woods did a few years later, and the internet wouldn't shut up about it. Now, to be fair, the subgenre wasn't exactly thriving at the time, but just the year before it, Brian Bertino's The Strangers proved that the subgenre could still be a major financial hit, and so Triangle's marketing drew a noticeably obvious comparison in an attempt to attract a similar audience. But once you unmask the killer plotline, Triangle becomes a very different experience. According to its writer-director Christopher Smith, Triangle is basically either a story grounded in a logical explanation stemming from the central protagonist's psychological breakdown, or an existential look at our personal morality that uses the age-old superstition of the Bermuda Triangle as the basis for its allegory. There is no one way to look at it, except that the film's central protagonist Jess is both the victim and, more significantly, the villain of the story, where the true conflict she's trying to overcome is purely herself. When the entire slasher formula is played out to a T by the halfway mark, Jess discovers that the masked killer was actually a doppelganger of herself, revealing that she's trapped in a loop of repeating the same events, and the only way to supposedly escape it is to kill the group she's with. It's a captivating way to set the stage for a genuinely soul-destroying character study about self-destruction. It questions the premise of what exactly makes you a good person when every single one of us is plagued with flaws and dark thoughts that are just inescapably part of human nature. Its confusing, sometimes flustered presentation is strikingly fitting to Jess's character. The lack of answers to many of its questions is part of the existential journey. You simply aren't going to get answers to everything that happens in life, and that's exactly where Jess's tragic journey comes to its conclusion. The film works best when it depends on raw human impulsiveness and inconsequentialism rather than simply trying to cleverly piece together how this infinite loop of Jesses actually works. It's cool, sure, and I'm not against how anyone chooses to engage with the film because it's a film for God's sakes, but strictly speaking, understanding the technicalities of the loop is not what matters. It's understanding the pain that Jess is experiencing that truly defines the story. Now, I must address that the most common interpretation for the film is that it's based on the Greek myth of Sisyphus, a deceptive, murderous king who was punished by Hades in the afterlife to roll a boulder up a steep hill for all eternity, and upon reaching the top of the hill, the boulder would immediately roll back to the bottom, making Sisyphus's efforts constantly useless. From this, it's easy to draw parallels between Sisyphus and Jess's eternal ordeal, and just in case you missed the very apparent Greek allegory, the film makes a clear point to tell us that the boat is called Aeolus, the Greek god of winds and the father of Sisyphus. However, as much as I would love to just spend the rest of the video spitting out all the Greek stuff because it would make my job a hell of a lot easier, there would be nothing to gain from it because there are countless videos and articles that already cover it, hence why I like to look at these kinds of popularly covered films as a broad, lighthearted, emotional stream of consciousness. I think by the end of the movie, most people will rightfully hate Jess's character when they start to draw specific binary conclusions, but I think its most challenging aspect is confronting you with that darker, colder, nastier, selfish side of you that we all try our best to control. I would argue that the film is probably more profoundly impactful if you're a parent, because it really comes to define Jess's story, and as someone who is not a parent, it's difficult to empathize with certain aspects of Jess's journey, so I'm curious to hear what actual parents have to say in the comments below about the conclusion's startling revelation. In the opening, we get out-of-context fragments of Jess's forlorn morning routine as she tries to get her son ready for school before going on her sailing trip. It establishes the notion that something isn't right, but since we've yet to firmly plant ourselves in Jess's shoes, we're simply on the outside looking in like we do with anyone we know. It's once we get to know Jess, escape the loop, and finally see the events again from her perspective that we learn that there's a lot more that happens behind closed doors. Her anger and frustration consumed her, and she took it out on her autistic son before instantly regretting it, knowing full well that she lost control and hates herself for what she did. Her doppelganger's response isn't forgiveness, but rather a perpetuation of self-hatred as she figuratively and literally kills herself and attempts to escape her old life with her son to start anew as if nothing ever happened. However, this isn't a story about redemption, it's about punishment. In fact, I wouldn't exactly call Jess's circumstances a purgatory, even though by definition it is. I think it's more terrifying to consider it as a secular interpretation of hell. We have someone bound to eternally suffer an agonizing punishment of having to live through her darkest moment over and over again, which to me is far more realistically scary than demons and pits of fire and things that are more or less exclusively dependent on absolute faith. Every time Jess tries to run away from her problems, it inadvertently leads to a car crash that kills her son, showing us that she's doomed to repeat an endless cycle of self-torment for the pain she's caused to others. In fact, I read one interpretation that suggests that Jess killed her son by accident in the opening, and every time she loops back, she tries to fix the problem by killing her doppelganger instead, making it a significantly more poignant allegory, and one that I personally prefer to agree with. But regardless of how you see it, her fate rests purely on the burden of death. No matter what she tries to do, she will always have to relive it day after day, moment after moment. The film has an overwhelming sense of loneliness to it, as if it never feels like Jess is even part of this world. Her connections to others is alienating because she's wallowing in self-pity, unaware that she grows more and more distant from reality. I feel the film's main motif is an emphasis on a never-changing routine. Jess's son needs his routine to be perfectly identical every day, or he gets incredibly anxious. Jess's loop is then a perpetual reminder of this. She's living her son's burden, which by extension mirrors her own confined routine as a parent who has to do everything alone as the world gradually overwhelms and swallows her whole. I think if I was to best summarize the film, I would say it's almost an allegory for the struggles of single parenting, which would align itself with Christopher Smith's narrative themes as we saw from the homeless allegory buried within Creep. Yet, in an even more broader sense, it's a terrifying portrayal of accepting responsibility for your own actions. You simply cannot run away from your responsibilities when it affects others around you. I know myself that I actively try to avoid things that make me feel pain, embarrassment, or fear of retribution, but over time I've learned to find relief in owning my mistakes. By not taking responsibility, Jess's preceding actions hurt more and more people. It creates a domino effect of disaster everywhere she goes. So whether you see the film as about mental illness or simply a Greek tragedy or about the necessity of confronting painful truths or experiences, it's worth giving Triangle some love for trying to invent the slasher genre, even if its impact was ultimately minimal. So to end, if you have any suggestions for horror media that you feel is misunderstood, misrepresented, or simply forgotten, please leave them in the comments below. And until next time, stay safe, and I'll see you all very soon.